I'd just like to thank Mark and Nuria and all the Starts people for the invitation to make this presentation. It's been really quite a privilege to do this. And I'd also like to thank my group psychotherapy colleagues who have helped me with the preparation for this. And many of them are actually attending today, so I'm hoping that it might help enrich the discussion a bit later. But to you, the audience, I'd like to say I have only one slide, but it's a good one. And I'm doing that quite deliberately because I'd rather speak directly to you as much as that's possible on a screen. And I also need to sort of alert you to the fact that what I have to say is going to be somewhat theoretical, but there's a reason for that. Mark, whose presentation follows mine, will be talking about a real life group. And I'd just like to lay a little bit of groundwork so that it might help enrich the learning and the discussion in the later part of the presentation. So I crave your indulgence and attentiveness for the next 30 minutes. And because it's 30 minutes, we better get going. In this presentation, I'd like to address three questions. The first is, why consider using the group as a medium for therapeutic intervention? The second, why consider the group specifically when working with young people who have suffered trauma and displacement? And the third question, what demands does the provision of group interventions impose on the organisation which offers them? So the first question, why the group? Now, I need to say something about the nature of the group, and apologies for those who might be familiar with this, but what are therapeutic groups? Why are they different? And what do they offer? Well, for some, it's about the economic advantage of being able to deal with more people in a given space and time than seeing them individually. And along with this, the group is commonly seen as a forum in which to work with individuals in a group setting. For some, the group is a forum for teaching, as in psychoeducational groups. And as legitimate as these endeavours are in their own way, they remain focused on the individual and miss a fundamental point in understanding the group, and that is that the human being is preeminently a social being rather than an individuality, as we are wont to believe. You see, we can only exist within a social framework, and this means that our groupishness itself can be used as a therapeutic medium. So to grasp this, we have to be able to see the group. Now, this is where I'm hoping my wonderful slide will appear on the screen. It's a simple optical illusion, but what we're looking at is a familiar gestalt, a figure ground conundrum. Now, as a general principle, we can only see one image at a time, even when we know that the other one exists. It takes some effort to switch between images. We have to change our perceptual configuration when we move from perceiving one image to the other. Now, I'm going to argue here that to see the group, we have to change how we configure what we observe. We are so used to perceiving the individual that we do not see the group. We can see the individual in the group, but we miss seeing the group in the individual. So we can take that one down now, thanks. To see the group, we have to be able to perceive the system. Now, take this. What do you see? Most of us, including me, will say, This is a leaf. But is it? It can only really be called a leaf if it is actually functioning as a leaf, as part of the respiratory and photosynthetic operation of the tree. If you like, it is truly a leaf when it is leafing. We might call it a leaf, but actually it's decaying vegetation. It's operating in a different system. The so-called leaf is dismembered from the tree and its nature is altered. Now we can speak about dismemberment in relation to our own bodies. Suppose I chop off a thumb. For one thing, my thumb is no longer a thumb. And for another, my whole organism must reconfigure and reorganize to accommodate the absence. So what happens to the human being who gets socially dismembered from the social organism in which that person exists? This can range from loss or grief on the one hand, all the way along a spectrum to mental illness of all kinds. The loss of a loved one is a social severance from shared relationship and is both painful and separating. It's a dismemberment. And we have to adapt to an altered social reality. The mentally ill person may be described as one who is dismembered from ordinary social intercourse and convention, and relatively lost unto themselves and to others. I suggest that there are lacunae in all of us which are cut off from ourselves, from our social network, which may be the source of distress or disturbance. We are wont in our usual socially normative way of thinking to see problems in ourselves and in others as individual problems. But if you think about it, all problems are embedded in relationship, whether past or present. They are disturbed ways of being in relation to oneself, to other human beings, and to the world. Now, while it is perfectly natural to think of assisting people in very individualized ways, according to our social convention, it is also possible to think in terms of using the group as a medium of intervention. Michael Balint, a prominent psychoanalyst and group analyst from mid-last century, famously said that a neurotic person may emerge from individual therapy less neurotic, but not more socially functioning. And the same person may emerge from group therapy no less neurotic, but more socially adapted and functioning. Now, that's a caricature, of course, but it raises two crucial questions. To what end are we helping people? So is it better to focus on having functioning individuals than on a functioning society? And the other question, by what means do we do that? Do we address the individual or the relationships within which the individual exists? Whereas individual therapy relies upon the interpersonal relationship between person and therapist, group psychotherapy uses the medium of the whole group. The group psychotherapist has the task of assisting the group to form and to maintain itself. As it forms, it exposes its members to each other, to their own foibles, their shameful bits, and their conflicts. The forming group is then able to assist members to address social dismemberment, their sources of distress, and encourage them to be remembered into social engagement with each other. So the health of members is correlated with the quality of relationship with others and, of course, with oneself. But I might add a word here about shame. We have all experienced it, and it has this noteworthy characteristic that it is about being seen, about how we see ourselves and how we imagine we are seen by others. It is therefore essentially relational, and it is also intimately connected to our shared humanness. We all experience it, and yet paradoxically, it cuts us off from others. One powerful effect of the group is when its members can find mutual connection with each other, such that shame can catalyze into a sense of shared humanity and connection. The group therapist, therefore, is one skilled in encouraging dialogue between members, skilled in assisting members to engage with each other and to find ways of negotiating blocks and impasses towards social understanding, towards integration and self-realization. This is a different skill set from dealing with individuals alone. The aim of the group is to remember the person into the social fabric of existence, to find a better way to be in relation with self, other, and the world. So let me move on to the second question, and that is, why the group for the traumatized or the dislocated? There's a significant overlap between the experience of traumatized people and refugees. And for purposes here, I'll reference those who have suffered trauma. But what I specifically want to do is to look at trauma through a social prism. Trauma is a wound or injury which occurs when fundamental assumptions about the world, about others, social order, human affairs are destroyed in some fashion and have to be rebuilt. Those fundamental assumptions are formed over time by repeated social experience, cultural expectations, practice, behavior, beliefs about how things should be, and so on. Disaster or calamity overturns the order of things, disturbing one's sense of reality and affecting one's sense of security and of being in the world and with other people. This wound is profoundly dismembering. The presumed relational order based on trust, mutual respect, predictability is severed. So people in trauma go into themselves. They are psychologically cut off from others. They exhibit a certain self-centeredness based on an obsession with their own traumatic experience and the need for self-survival. Their contact with a social world is disrupted, distorted, tenuous, and they are intent on preventing further trauma and hanging on to self-integrity. The refugee bears certain traumatic elements: loss of culture, loss of social familiarity, loss of language, ways of thinking and processing. Now we know that identity is linked in a profound way with our sense of cultural identity. If the latter is disrupted, so is our sense of self. And I think we just need to ask only our Indigenous communities about that. It's dismembering. Trauma gives rise to states of stress. Cortisol replaces adrenaline, and those affected can exhibit a mix of bewilderment, hypervigilance, mistrust, even paranoia, impatience, obsession and self-centeredness, tunnel vision, grimness, and intolerance. But the psychological injury is to the social fabric which weaves us together and which would otherwise embrace the traumatized person. It is also important to note that the experience of trauma is frequently associated with shame. Shame for being the victim, shame for the loss of agency and incapacity, whether that's physical or psychological, shame for decisions made or not made, or unable to be made in impossible situations. Shame in its many rationally and irrationally felt dimensions. If trauma is dismembering, then recovery from trauma, at some point at least, is a social process. And this is where the intervention of the group is to be considered and used. Groups offer the chance for this self-isolation to be tolerated and understood, a chance to listen to and to become engaged with the experiences of others at a manageable pace, in a setting that offers predictability and regularity, serving to foster engagement with others, to come out of the unhelpful self-obsession and restore trust. The group fosters agency over helplessness and despair, fosters capacity to think, to speak, and to act for oneself. It can address shame. In this way, it creates social capital. And by that I mean the social coherence and integration essential for social functioning, whether that's in family, in kinship, in friendship, in community, as a citizen. These are fundamental elements of recovery, healing, and psychological growth. So let me now direct this thinking to working with refugee children and young people. And bear in mind that Mark is going to present something a little bit more approachable in a way than this rather dry topic. But here we go. All that has been said here about trauma has specific implications for children. Children are developmentally in transition, expanding from the intimacies of family and kinship to embrace progressively wider relationships, friends, peer groups, community, the wider social system, and citizenship. Every step on the way is a relational gateway towards the development of the person who can function with appropriate agency in the social world. This is the functioning hallmark of the healthy person. These steps implicitly embody significant vulnerability because failures and hiccups, while mostly important stepping stones, can have profound consequences for ongoing development. We are becoming more aware in our society, for example, of the effects of physical, emotional, and sexual abuse on the social development and functioning of the child, how these events can create indelible lacunae of social dismemberment, distress, and disturbance lasting well into adult life. For the refugee child, trauma can be manifest in many ways: loss of parents, loss of siblings, family, kinship, loss of home and community, loss of language and culture, which of course affect the development of thinking and meaning-making. Crucially, childhood trauma needs to be seen through this prism of social development, the developing capacities in the child towards health in the form of social engagement and sustenance, trust, intimacy, mutuality, and appropriate social functioning. In this context of understanding trauma socially, the group offers significant resources for young refugees. In a group, children can be engaged to reconnect as peers and find mutual acceptance, understanding, and capacity. They can find ways of communicating with each other, stimulating thinking and meaning-making. In so doing, the children can be helped to avoid or address the inevitable and debilitating shame that accompanies the notion that he or she individually is a problem. In the group, children are exposed to the social modeling of the group conductors when they treat them respectfully and appropriately, not just as individuals, but as a group. All this assists affected children to be able to re-establish some normality of social connection and to reboot psychological development. The work of the group, as you can see, focuses on the establishment and the functioning of the group itself, as much as on the functioning of the individuals within it. This includes the work needed to select and prepare members to join a group as much as for the operation of it. It serves to help the child who has experienced traumatic developmental disruption to find an adaptive, normal functioning. For those not schooled in this way of thinking and working, it can feel somewhat unnerving and like an enormous leap of faith. Yet, when grasped, the potential is significant. And this takes us back to the earlier comments about being able to see the group, to trust in the process of it, and to engage with its possibilities. It does require the practitioner to step aside from, not to abandon, the cultural focus on the health and functioning of the individual, but to also be able to observe the health and functioning of the group itself. So the final question, what should organisations consider when thinking about the group? I've invited you into the task of observing the group. So remember the leaf. Now I have to ask you, if we have a group of refugee children, in what system is the provision of that group located? Without being too dogmatic about this, I want to put the following for your consideration. Arguably, I have to say that group interventions for refugee children are best provided by an organisation, and ideally that organisation should be a public sector, community-based, not-for-profit organisation. I would say that there is a public responsibility to provide for the recovery and health of refugees who hopefully one day will take their places as citizens and community members. Such work requires a holding organisational structure and a commitment to task, and Starts is a good example of such an organisation. But it should also be said that such organisations need to be clear about what it means to undertake this task. Firstly, all that has been said above, because we are so culturally conditioned to focus on the individual, for most helping organisations, the group is unfamiliar, it's countercultural, misunderstood, and somewhat implicitly feared. Just as the therapeutic group has to form and to develop trust, so organisations are usually faced with the same task of developing trust in the use and functioning of groups within its provision. This may not be easy, nor readily embraced. Organisations are conventionally risk-averse, so understandably and appropriately, organisations must proceed down the group path with awareness, caution, consideration, and respect. Crucially, it requires a reconfiguring of expectations and outcome, and for tolerance of the work itself, as you might see in Mark's presentation. Secondly, there are practical considerations. Organizations must be able to provide the space, material, resources, expertise, and supervision needed for groups to work. This can feel to be an added burden on already stretched resources. This is in spite of the fact that groups can be seen as for their economic advantage. Rooms need to be set aside and set up. It is not uncommon for unwitting sabotage to occur. For example, and I've experienced this in quite a few settings, group rooms can be double booked or used randomly for meetings, used for storage, let fall into disarray, or not maintained in the same way as more personalized spaces are. In other words, there are particular administrative demands. Thirdly, there is a widespread mistrust and suspicion about groups that they don't work. Well, they do require requisite expertise to conduct them, and that is not always the case. It can often be said in an organization, and I've heard this too, oh, well, let's just run a group, overlooking what is required to make it happen and to run successfully. When groups founder or get into difficulty, organizations typically find this more problematic than when individual work founders or gets difficult. Fourthly, I venture to suggest that there may be a socio-political underpinning to the problems posed by working with groups. The broad cultural bias towards the individual in our society preferences the health and socio-economic advancement of the individual at the expense of valuing the enrichment of the community in which individuals exist. Our political, social, economic discourse is split along these lines, and the work of the group may unconsciously stimulate cultural biases along these lines because the emphasis on the functioning group may be seen as a threat to valuing the health and advancement of the individual. Organizations in today's socioeconomic climate, with ubiquitous reliance on political support, can tread a fine line when their services become subject to scrutiny and when they allocate or seek funding. They may unconsciously feel the need to conform in quite implicit ways to cultural convention which emphasizes the individual over the socialist alternative. I may be drawing a long bow here, but I put it forward as a possible reckoning when considering group interventions in organizations. What is certain, however, is that offering group interventions, particularly for traumatized people, requires a commitment to do so based on an understanding of the group and a willingness to offer ongoing support for those operational requirements to prepare for and to maintain a functioning group program. And that might not always be easy. But finally, on the positive, where group programs have been embraced by organizations, they can lead to a group-mindedness in the operation of the organization itself. Staff become more group conscious and team-oriented, increasing the collaboration between staff and improving the overall efficacy of the service and its work. So thank you for your attention. I can hand you back to Lachlan.